Good evening. Today we're going to be talking to Michael Ventura about the silent film era, which he's very knowledgeable about and has done a bit of writing about. So take us away, Michael.
Well, I got interested in silent film as a medium way back in the beginning of LA Weekly, which had its first issue. We put out the first issue of LA Weekly in November of '78. And that spring, Ginger Varney and I, we were the film department of the paper, and she discovered the silent movie theater on Fairfax, south of Melrose.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it was run by Dorothy and John Hampton, who lived upstairs. They owned the building. They had a passion for silent movies. When he got out from the war and with the GI Bill, he bought the building and they set up this theater. And he bought his, with their passion, they told us every time they get enough money for a down payment to a car, another silent film becomes available and they buy the print. So they lived in LA that whole time without a car. And every week the program changed. We kept tabs on it in the weekly. We'd always put it in the revival film section. Remember, used to have revival theaters showing all kinds of movies all over town, and there were about a dozen of them. And we always put the silent film theaters program in there. It had opened with what used to be called an actuality, which would be a half reel or a reel at most of what we would call documentary footage on some subject or some scene. I remember seeing Rome in a late 1890s, like 1 minute film of Rome before cars had gotten there. It was still an ancient city. It looked like it. You saw people, merchants coming with donkeys on an ancient Roman road, and there it was. You saw that footage from as they call it, the Holy Land, where a lot just had not changed in terms of tactile reality, in terms of how people dressed, in terms of how people got from here to there, in terms of the buildings, in terms of the boats. And then there would be a Keystone chaplain. Keystone made 33 or 34 or 35 films with Keystone in 1914 and became the most famous man in the world by the end of the year. And I loved those Keystones. They were crazy. It wasn't funny, haha. It was funny, weird, funny, the sense that audience got of watching people do crazy stuff. And films didn't really end, they stopped.
Yeah.
They stopped. There's no resolution to it. And so I became interested way back then in the medium. I knew I would one day want to write about this some way. And now, since digital transfers, a lot is available that was never available. So film history really is in the process of being rewritten, because we can see things that even academics and scholars and big universities didn't have. It hadn't been restored. There wasn't a way to restore it well. Physically, it had to be restored digitally, and digital didn't exist yet. So since about 2000, I have a silent film library now that the greatest university in the world could not have had 25 years ago. And I got very interested as I watched. There's a box set of Edison films. There's a box set of films by Méliès, the Georges Méliès. I'm pronouncing it wrong. Strong, the great animator in France. There's a box set of the Gaumont Studio films with the amazing director Ali Ski, and I got fascinated in what people use the motion picture camera for. Now, you go back to, this is a time of incredible innovation. As you know, it's 1877, and Edison invents the phonograph. Out of nowhere. I mean, nobody ever thought of that. And then he doesn't invent the light bulb, but in 1880 he's able to market the first marketable light bulbs. And did not know, of course, that he was inventing what motion pictures most needed, which was projected electric light. In 1888, George Eastman invents film, and what are you going to do with it? The photographic processes of the time are totally different. They don't use film. And he invents his film on in rolls of 80 millimeter rolls. 70 millimeter rolls. There weren't cameras for it. Here this invention was that people had wanted. One of the things you find out when you're looking at stuff that I'm looking at, and I know you've been researching, is inventions happen in clusters.
Yeah.
During the 1880s, a lot of people, mostly in England and France, but also Germany and the United States, were trying to invent motion pictures. And I made a list of these people, the ones we know about, and I think I'd like to just read their names because they are totally forgotten, almost all of them. Bert Ackrids, Ottomar Anschutz, Léon Guillaume-Bouly, W.C. Crops, Pierre Desvignes, Wordsworth Donnestrop, Jules Dubosc, Mortimer Evans, William Fries Green, Etienne Jules Marie, William George Horner, Charles Jenkins, Louis LapFrance, Robert Paul, Joseph Plateau, Emile Reynaud, John Arthur Roebuck Rudge, Emile Skladanowski, Frederick Varley, Charles Wheatstone. Those are the ones we knew of. They were all working in the 1880s to invent the motion picture camera. Bouly coined the word cinema. Out of everything all those guys did, that word came out and became history. They worked tirelessly. Most of them didn't know about each other. Edison didn't know about them. And Edison decided he'd already had made these inventions, as we said. He decided he wanted to try to record pictures to go along with the sounds from the phonograph. He was trying to invent sound pictures. And they couldn't quite get that done. But he employs this Scottish photographer, W.K.L. Dixon, and who has an assistant named William Heise, I think you pronounce it. And he employs him. What Edison's really overall invention was he invented the industrial laboratories. His were the first industrial laboratories. He'd get kind of an idea, and he'd see the basic principles of it. He'd hire 2 or 3 people to work on it, and have the resources that he could give them to work on it. And it wasn't that he didn't contribute to the principles of the thing, but he would take 100% of the credit. So he gives it to W.K.L. Dixon as a I said, a Scottish photographer. And the first thing Dixon does is he looks at Eastman's 70 millimeter film, and basically his attitude was, I can't work with that, it's too huge. And he chops it in half and gives us the 35 millimeter film size that was standard in the industry for the next more than 100 years until the industry digitalized. That's the 35 millimeter film that you see on the screen. And Dixon did it by just going, I can't work with 70 millimeters, but chop, and invented a sprocket system. Now, one of the things that had made it so hard to invent a motion picture camera was before film, they were inventing it, almost all those guys, in fact, all those guys, invented it, were trying to invent it on chemically treated paper. And the paper wasn't strong enough to take more than one or two rolls.
Yeah.
You know, you could sprocket it, you could reinforce the holes around the sprockets, but the paper just wasn't strong enough to handle this. And so while William Freeze Green, well, they've restored about 3 seconds of film on Trafalgar Square in the 1880s, and they pretty much figured out that Louis Le Prince was the first person to photograph motion, a few seconds of motion, 2 or 3 instances of it. He, by the way, got on a train somewhere in France and disappeared. Totally disappeared off the face of the earth. He was the first person to photograph motion that it looks like people are moving. The focus sucks, it's inconsistent, but it wasn't film. He's not the first person to film. W.K.L. Dixon in, what would it have been? It would have been 1891. He's figured out the sprockets. He's figured out the how to use the film, and he makes about a 1-second film of himself bidding welcome with a straw hat. It goes on for about as long as it takes to say one, but it was the first film. It was the first person to be photographed on film. And Edison was very pleased. He thought highly of it. He brought in people to see it, reporters and such. Everybody was wowed by it, but what are you going to do with it? Edison's idea of what to do with it was to put it in a box. Edison, the invention he was concerned with wasn't so much the motion picture as commercializing the motion picture as you make these 30-second or 1-minute films, even less than that, 5-second, 10-second, and they run on a continuous spool in a machine called a kinetoscope, and people pay a nickel to see them, Nickelodeon. And he never thought of projecting them. And he sets up this Nickelodeon parlor on Broadway in Manhattan. I believe it was 1894. And people line up to see little motion pictures from Nicholas shop. And the big money maker that year was really boxing was illegal in the United States, but staging boxing to be photographed was not a staged fight. And I mean, boxing went on all over the country, but out of it got very famous, but out of view of the law, the Mexican towns in Nevada. And people like Bat Masterson and Wired Up were referees, got very famous that way after all the stuff, the OK Corral. And so he stages the Corbett Courtney fight. And really, if you look at it, it is a homoerotic soft porn film of mostly the behind of Corbett, who's basically just got a strap, his buttocks fully exposed, beating up on Courtney, who is littler and not as muscular. It really looks like a stage mugging. And goes on for a minute and a half, which was very long for the time.
You know, that's interesting because the first real radio broadcast was a boxing match.
Huh.
Yeah, that was Sarnoff's first idea for the first radio broadcast.
That's really something. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And a strange country with strange values, strange culture. But the other early films were things like butterfly dancers, they called them. And there was shimmy dancers, and they were all filmed in this little studio of Edison's with sunlight. It was rotated. It was called the Black Maria. It was rotated to get the sun, and very confined. They were basically vaudeville turns. And Oakley shot stuff thrown into the air. That was one of the only outdoor ones. And boxers, weightlifters. Again, a lot of strangely homoerotic, mostly naked men. The women were much more clothed. And so film has been invented, but it's in a box. Now, Edison brings that box to Paris. We're talking late 1894, early 1895. And one of the people there to see it is named Lumiere. And he buys one of the boxes for a lot of money, like thousands of francs. And he runs a photography supply factory with his sons, Lumiere brothers, and he says to his sons, "You can do better. Get that thing out of the box." His sons buy up Boulet's patent, the guy who invented the word cinema. He'd done some interesting work, but they improve on it a great deal. And they invent a camera setup that this is 1895 now, that in one box can shoot the film, develop the film, and project the film. And uncannily, the focus, the black and whites of these Lumieres are just beautiful. Way better a black and white film than the Edisons were doing. A lot more clarity. And it is the Lumieres who get the idea of showing some of their films in a cafe to about 30 paying people. And this is pretty much, I mean, there are people who dispute it. They say, no, this was the first, this was the first, this was the first. But the first projected film, they lasted about 30 seconds. They probably didn't have music to them. I mean, being played around them. And they are gorgeous. People leaving the factory. A train train coming into a station, which made the people in the theater, it's not really a theater, it's a cafe, get up from their seats, get out of the way. They'd never seen anything like that. Footage of a train coming into a station. Now, the first tracking shot, literally, that anybody had ever done. And while Edison is filming all these carnival kind of things and filming them crudely, the Lumieres manufacture several cameras and give them to people they call operators, and they give them the money to go around the world and film the streets. And so in the surviving Lumieres, besides the beautiful photography that these amazing machines could do, the surviving Lumieres, you're seeing Western cities, and you're seeing New York City, you're seeing European cities, and some Asian, and some Egyptian, before the car. Before the car became a mass event. There were cars around, very few, and cities were not inundated with them. In fact, the bicycle had just been invented, or perfected, or mass-produced. I wouldn't say invented. And that was the major transportation in New York City. There were hundreds of bicycles all over the place. And that was going on in Europe, China. And it's so interesting to me, the difference in subject matter, where when Max Sennett said we turned a cheap trick carnival device into an industry. It basically was that. The motion picture camera basically was that for the first 8 years of its existence, 9 years of its existence. In America, in Europe, it was, especially France, it was different. Now, thinking about the cultures, in France, remember, you're at a height of visual perception in the culture. The Impressionists, many of them are still alive, Monet, Cézanne, the 1890s, Van Gogh has just died, Gauguin is still alive. So you've got this heightened visual sense in the culture. Cameras are much more popular in France than anywhere else. And the first people to get to, you have the Lumieres who are camera parts manufacturers, then Gaumont, also camera manufacturer, begins his studio. I'll tell you about that in a second. And there's this heightened visual sense that Edison and his guys just don't have, and that you don't see in the United States for a while. And this is something that film history just left out when I was coming up. They didn't have the material. You can't blame them for it. But once the material became available, film history is starting to, the writing of it is starting to change. It has been changing. So Gaumont sees what the Lumieres are doing. It isn't that hard now that you know it can be done. It isn't that hard to invent your own kind of motion picture camera. If you're a factory that produces cameras. And Gaumont has a secretary named Alice Guy, and G-Y, Guy or Guy, I believe Guy. Later she marries and she's Alice Guy Blanche. And she's an impressive person, and he trusts her, make films. These guys are doing it. What are you doing? Be in charge of that. And she is credited the first person to make what we would call a narrative film, where it's a film about something happening. You dwell on it. It isn't a freak show. She has some wonderful feat of film of boys playing in a stream. But what she's really photographing is the water, and the light on the water, and the light on the boys. Her stuff is beautifully shot. All that early stuff of hers. And because you don't have a great deal of sunlight in Northern Europe, if you're looking at English TV, as you and I do, you can count on your fingers in any given show the shots that have sunlight. I mean, basically, it's a gray sky. Same thing in France. And you have lots of days of rain, or you had. And so it became natural for these people to invent a studio. Not the Black Mariah of Edison, but by 1900, Alice Guy is working in a studio, photographs of it, and this isn't hypothesis. Working in a studio with lighting, scenery, assistants, the whole works. In 1903, I believe, there's a little film, Alice Guy films a phono scene, and what they're doing is syncing up. She experimented with sounds of films for a long time, syncing up a performance directed for a camera with a recording that would be played with the showing of the film. And Georges Méliès, I'm pronouncing it wrong, M-E, accent grave, L-I-E, the other kind of accent, S, Méliès. A magician by trade, did the same thing. He's animating his films. He's doing all kinds of special effects. He's inventing special effects as the 1890s. Martin Scorsese made a lovely film about him called Hugo. You ought to look it up. But so he, in his A Trip to the Moon, get the exact date, something around 1898, and you see a close-up shot, you see a zoom shot. He's inventing all these shots. And the original A Trip to the Moon had a kind of risque narrative that people were supposed to read as the film went. But people didn't rediscover this narrative until, as I say, the last 15 years or so. So you're having Georges, let's call him, doing this animation and special effects, making literally hundreds of these short films of animation and special effects, comedy. And then you have Alice Guy making short films that are mostly comedy, and then broadening it into features. In 1906, I believe, she makes a film about the life of Christ. It's a feature film, about 50 minutes or so, several reels, done in the studio, done not with close-ups, although close-ups were with us right from the beginning of film. In one of the first films that Edison put in his kinetoscope was a sneeze, just a man sneezing. Neck up, it's a close-up. Close-up was right there in 1894. It kind of came with the camera. And it took a while for people to figure out what to do with it. But close-up was right there. But she did, instead of close-ups, kind of studies. When she put a new figure on the screen in the life of Christ, she would want you to see it. So there'd be the figure of Mary, and and then you just see Mary on the screen in costume looking at you, and then you go back to the mise en scene with the action of the film, and all of this, D.W. Griffith doesn't touch a camera, a motion picture camera, until 1908. The film Edward Porter doesn't film Working for Edison, doesn't film The Great Train Robbery until 1903. Now, The Great Train Robbery started the craze for story films in the United States, but that had been going on in Europe for several years. And again, The Great Train Robbery is primitive in photography compared to what Alice Guy and the Gaumont Studios and the Lumières were doing. On the other hand, The Great Train Robbery has an energy that nobody else had. It's purely American. You've got cowboys and Indians. You've got, not Indians, but you've got good guys and bad guys. You've got rustlers. You have several people getting shot dead. And at the very, very end, in some prints they also do this at the beginning, but in the original, at the very end, you have a close-up, shoulders to the tip of the hat, of a cowboy who takes a gun, the cowboy long-barreled revolvers, and fires at the audience. And it is apocryphal. Nobody's really proved it, but you hear a lot of stories about people in the audience firing back. And this was an enormous sensation. Creating the story film as a medium in this country. But again, you find, and this is, I'm not saying it's critical. I'm not bad-mouthing it. It's just what's there, the visual in front of you. You find the sensationalism, freak show. People have to be getting killed. My God, Edison even had somebody film the electrocution of an elephant. It goes on for about a minute and a half. I can only watch 2 seconds of it, the start of it. But, I mean, it's a snuff film. And in Europe, you have a completely different approach. Looking at stuff. Just for the sake of looking at stuff. And then telling stories that are more than just melodrama. Now, Europe, of course, had its own sensationalism. They were about to have the worst war in Western history at the time. And they began doing feature films, the Italians especially, epic kind of films. Starts with a C. Calibria, something like that. Other big films that D.W. Griffith sees, as he's been working at Biograph. He starts working at Biograph, and they're shooting in Manhattan and New Jersey in 1908. Now, from looking at the French films, D.W. Griffith perfects a sense of editing, which is his great contribution in terms of technique, that we still use today. Griffith's, his signatures is on all the editing tricks we use today. Yeah, he didn't invent the close-up. He didn't invent the narrative film. He didn't invent a lot of things he was getting credit for a long time. But he did perfect cross-editing and the tensions, etc., that could be made with editing. And he did melodramas, which essentially is what most dramatic films are. But he sees these Italian epic films, and that's when he wants to do a big film. Now you have a French director, Léonce Paré, and he directs for Gaumont in 1912 a picture called L'Enfant de Paris. And L'Enfant de Paris, a child of Paris. It's a story about a boy, in difficulty in Paris. It goes on for about 2 hours. It's elegantly shot. It's 2 or 3 years before The Birth of a Nation. It's consummate filmmaking, come to perfection, really, in France, and it's beginning to happen in Germany, beginning to happen in England. Great actress Sarah Bernhardt, when she was quite old and I think had lost a leg, was playing did several reels of Shakespeare, silent Shakespeare. I'm not sure of the point, but anyway. And Italians are making epics. Meanwhile, basing his films on French comedies by the Pathé studio, Max Sennett starts making comedies. He has the first comedy studio. And then, and this is all gets into the history of L.A., 1912, 1913, 1914, especially. 1914, basically there are about 4 large film outfits in Los Angeles. There's the Sennett outfit, Keystone, on what is now Glendale Boulevard and Effie, in what is now Echo Park and was then Edendale. There's Griffith's Lot, where Sunset Boulevard and Hollywood Boulevard meet. Huge lot there where he made Birth of a Nation and Intolerance. He filmed some of the war scenes in Birth of a Nation over the hill where Universal Studios now is. But most of the stuff he filmed at that lot. There's the Lasky Famous Players lot, which became Paramount. The original DeMille operation with Jesse Lasky, which was on Selma and Vine down to Santa Monica Boulevard, rather down to Sunset Boulevard. All of these places, by the way, the Senate lot, the DeMille, Jesse Lasky lot, and the Griffith lot were all built on former farms. It was all farmland when they came to L.A. Farmland and small businesses, but mostly farmland. And the Thomas Ince, who had made mostly cowboy films and was up in the mountains, up in the hills. There were other smaller outfits, including an African American outfit, making the first African American films. But those were the money makers, the people who created what became the industry and what became an American industry, mainly because World War I started in 1914, drew England, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, all these places that had started making films into this war. Every country was pretty devastated by it. It totally stopped the filming of almost anything. And by the end of the war, the United States had a world market on film. So, look, going back to what I'm really interested in was at the beginning of film, the subject matter was so different. In the French, with the French filmmakers Alice Guy, at Gaumont, where also Léonce Perret would film in 1912. Pathé with their comedies in the early 1900s. So different from the American films. And I really don't know. I'm not going to make big generalizations on why. But you have to look and realize that the American films, when compared to the films of Europe at the time, were crude. Now, Europe was about to tumble into the worst war, a war in which hundreds of thousands would be killed within 10 days in a battle. saying that Europe was more sensitive than the Americans and all that. Obviously, they were not. And yet, what the people who had cameras, what they could do with them, those choices were very different. And the crudity, and I say this as an American writer who loves American culture, the crudity of American culture was right there, right at the beginning of this meeting.
Yeah, I think Edison even I've read a quote by him, but I've not seen it really verified. But he said something like that he favored sex and violence in his films. That somehow he was going to get a larger audience or something with sex and violence. Even Edison.
Well,
so.
It shows up in the early films. One of the first films he did was the beheading of Mary Queen of Scots, and especially if you've never seen, you're just looking at people on the screen. It's a pretty convincing beheading. He has a short film about guys being brought up blindfolded in front of a firing squad. 1, 2, 3, fire, and they all fall down dead. That's the end of the film. And the most scandalous film he had, and we're now about 1886-ish, there was a scandalous play called The Kiss. And it ended with two fully clothed people, actor and actress, kissing for a long time, a long kiss, and then the curtain came down. And that play was censored, and it was terrible, and blah, 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 and everybody made a big deal of it. And so Edison filmed The Kiss. That's all it was in the film, The Kiss. And it became so popular that he had to film it several times, all over again, because all the prints got destroyed as they were running all around being shown so often in the kinetoscope parlors. That's what they call them, parlors. Another thing you see, and I haven't seen this commented upon, is in the kinetoscope parlors, which grew up in all the big cities when in the period before films were projected. So we're talking in the late 1890s in the U.S. When you see the photographs, it's mostly men. You very rarely see a woman in this. It's a male medium. Now, Edison had already had, and this is a kind of a footnote, parlors, quote unquote, where people came in to listen to phonographs. You came in and you paid a nickel, and you had the little earphones, and you listened to an opera singer or something. And in the pictures of those, you do see women. But you don't see women in the pictures. There's not enough material to make a generalization. But didn't seem to be a ladylike thing. God knows it wasn't a respectable thing to indulge in film right from the beginning. And the actors who first played in the flickers, as they were called, the actors were called movies. Not the pictures were called flickers, and the actors were called movies. And so you see signs in Los Angeles, no movies allowed. In boarding houses and stuff, no movies, because they weren't considered respectable people. In any case, that's what I wanted to talk about. I love watching those films. You can, if you YouTube Lumiere's, Lumiere, you can probably see Lumiere, a string of Lumiere pictures. They made hundreds, and about 110 still exist, and about 30 seconds. I mean, you see one after another. here was this medium suddenly out of nowhere. Not quite out of nowhere because people had photographs, but in the 1880s, suddenly in Europe and the United States, there were a bunch of people who wanted to see photographs move. And as the stories about them are unearthed, and you see some of their efforts, though they last only for seconds, I think of it as an inexplicable, joyous moment in history. Even though some people understood at the time, oh boy, we're opening a Pandora's box here and nobody knows what's going to come out of it.
I wanted to take it back a little bit to the very inception and that period of time, because I think that there's a higher level to the like, as we were talking about, people start coming out with patents and inventions that kind of spring up on their own without them interacting with each other, kind of all over the West. So it's almost like kind of a precipitation of this idea into the human mind, and at that time, in the 1870s and 1880s, there's this what's usually called a conflict between religion and science, right? And there's this with the Industrial Revolution and everything, and the exploration of science, people start to question some of the things in the Bible and archaeology and things like that. But at the same time, there's this explosion of different spiritual concepts too, and one of the interesting things is that Edison was a devout student of theosophy, and the idea of theosophy was that was kind of a science of religion, like looking at it scientifically and looking at it as like a science of the soul. And when we look at the mechanics of a film projector and film and how this works, it really is correspondential to a lot of Platonic ideas and Hermetic ideas, where you have this light that you could compare to spirit, and then you have a film that you could say was an idea, and then the light shoots through this film or this idea, and it's projected onto the screen, which you could think of as matter. Are you following me?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like in the Bible, the breath upon the waters, right? And the idea of a projection of spirit onto matter. And so that screen is always there, that primal matter, or what in Sanskrit it's called mula prakriti, that there's always this sea or chaos, or it's what Mary represents so when the light goes out and the projection stops, that matter is still there. It's just not having the idea projected onto it. But I mean, you could go on and on with analogies between these metaphysical concepts and the whole mechanics of film projection. And I think it's interesting that Edison was so interested in those Platonic or Hermetic concepts on one end, and then he kind of he and other people, that this idea comes along at that same time, that of this projection of your own idea, which you have put on film onto a screen, as you will, so I hope that I got that across all right. But
I think so.
Yeah,
I got it.
You know what I mean, right? Yeah.
Yes,
But
yes.
having been a projectionist myself, I thought of that a lot, and I was also thinking that as you what you started with those people that had the silent film theater, that must have been a very difficult or fragile projection situation where the film itself must have been quite fragile, right? The prints that they...
It was quite fragile. It was also quite flammable.
Right, yeah.
It was something to just explode.
And placing it on the platters and putting it through the reel, and then connecting them all and putting them all in a consecutive order on the platters must have been a real chore and very a very fragile prospect.
Yes, and it as the prints were circulated, they got grainy, they got torn, things were missing. Projectionists, if they really liked a little passage, or if one was very sexy or something, would cut it out for themselves and resplice the film.
Yeah.
And I know as a kid going to neighborhood theaters in New York City, you weren't seeing the first run prints. I mean,
right. Yeah.
They could get grainy pretty quick.
Yeah. What happened to that theater?
John died, John Hampton. Dorothy continued for a little while. She was very frail. Last time I saw her, we had promoted the Cityways Mill estate. The Mill heard of that theater, late 40s, early 50s. He's a huge big shot by then. And the Mill estate would give them a print of his King of Kings, 1924, I think it was, to run. And Ginger and I hyped it pretty good. In fact, we did an interview with John and Dorothy and put that in the weekly, and that got them some business. They owned the building, and so they ran everything themselves. I mean, they didn't have any employees. So it was a delicate life. If you look the place up, the information you find about it is false. They say that it stopped existing in 1978 or something. Nope. It did. It went on for I don't know, 82, maybe 83. Anyway, the last time I was there, Dorothy was on her own doing it, and some people helping her, and she didn't look like she was going to last a whole long time. And then the next time I was aware of it, it had passed over into other hands, and then somebody got killed in it, and there was all this other stuff. The last time I was in L.A., which was a while ago in that neighborhood, the plant was still there. It still said the Silent Movie Theater.
Yeah.
But that was a few years ago, with John and Dorothy long dead.
I wonder what happened to the prints that they had.
I've wondered too. Also, they had prints that at the time, Ginger and I being film critics on the LA Weekly, we had all the catalogs and everything to look at. And I would see films, it's in the books now, Mabel Norman's The Nickel Dancer, 1927. And that's where I saw a Mabel Norman picture without Charlie Chaplin in it for the first time. And I went, who's she? And we looked in our books. It wasn't there. But Mabel Norman's a whole other story. She got erased from film history pretty quickly. In any case, yeah, they had a hard time of it, and I don't know where the prints ended up.
Yeah. There's a funny story in my life from when I was doing projection, and so I'm working as a projectionist, and Terry Boyle, the guy who managed the New Art, he's the guy that taught me how to do projection, and one day he tells me, I want you to go down to the Greyhound station and pick up a print. And we're going to show it on Wednesday night for a special showing. And so I go down to the Greyhound station and I pick it up and I look at the tape on the outside of the box, and it says it's a mad, mad, mad world, right? So we're having a special showing of It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. So I think that's kind of funny, and I bring it up to the theater on Wednesday morning, and I put it on the platter and everything, and so that night at I think it was 7:30, and I start the showing, and the only person that came to see It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World, and I can only assume that it was just a special presentation for her. I'm not sure who did it. Was Jane Russell. So I screened It's a Mad, Mad, Mad World at a art theater on top of a mountain in Santa Barbara for Jane Russell. Was the only person in the theater. And I talked to her after the movie. She was very gracious, very nice lady. Yeah, cool.
I always thought she would be. That's great. That's a great story.
Yeah.
That's a good place to end this.
Yeah.
This session. That's wonderful.